welcome to the MessianTics podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode, we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now, here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby. Hey guys, thanks for joining us for another episode. We are, as we said last time, going to be working through a series of episodes dealing with our thoughts on how to better formulate a more formal arrangement for the Messianic Jewish movement for a better longevity of future. And we're not saying we have all the answers, but just thoughts. We're just throwing out thoughts and ideas that we have. And if they're helpful, awesome. If they're not, then we tried. So, but with that, we're kind of just picking up where we left off on the last episode, which is on the conversation of education. Rabbi Toby, Rabbi Jonathan brought up some really good points in dealing with education and what is or isn't required, what should be or shouldn't be required. And so we wanted to kind of flesh that out a little farther in this episode. And I'm a huge proponent for adequate education. That doesn't mean it needs to be too much education. But like we were talking off the episode after we finished up, and we were talking about how a lot of I went to a Christian college for my undergrad. It was a concentration in Messianic Jewish studies, but it was a Christian college, a Christian liberal arts school, to be honest. So at a Christian liberal arts school, in order to get my pastoral ministries degree with a concentration in Messianic Jewish studies, which realistically could have been a year and a half, 2 years max worth of classes, I also had to do a full 4-year program that included all of the math and science and education, or math, science, and history and all that other stuff that I really didn't need. Like it wasn't going to affect anything. And so I think that's kind of absurd. But one of the things that I do think is really interesting in the discussion of moving from fellowship to a more formal organization is, in a more formal organization, again, as we said last time, and Rabbi Eric brought this up, if we stop thinking about only our localized community and start thinking of the greater kingdom and the greater Messianic movement, if we are willing to financially sow into an organization like that, it could be feasibly possible to set up a rabbinic yeshiva, legitimate yeshiva program that younger leaders, younger people interested in going to become a Messianic rabbi, or people that are not younger but are interested in becoming a Messianic rabbi, feel that calling even later in life, are able to go through a kind of core curriculum that's needed for education to qualify to be a rabbi, which I think would be absolutely great. I mean, the UMJC, as Rabbi Toby said, they're this isn't a complaint about them. I think in some ways, education-wise, they've solved some problems that I think is a little lax on the other side. But the UMJC is a very strict, you almost need a master's degree. It's pretty close to a full master's degree to become a ordained UMJC rabbi, plus a bunch of other stuff. Within the IMCS, it's just a series of random yeshivot classes that you have to take, and there's not even necessarily a categorization on you need to take this kind of class, one of these and one of these and one of these. There's a little bit of that, but there's like hundreds to choose from, and you just pick and choose what's just to get it done and out the way.
And it's pass fail. Yeah, exactly. And I had to, when I wrote mine, when I did my papers and sent them in, I didn't hear from anybody for the longest time. And I was like, hey, did you get my paper? And I didn't hear from anybody. So you can't check because you can't check you don't have a transcript to check. And I would get an email back saying, oh yeah, hey, Toby, got it, you passed. Yeah. I was like, okay.
See, I think if we had a more formal organization, it would be relatively simple to say, okay, we have these online classes, like actual legitimate, you sit through a class one day, 2 days a week, Zoom class, whatever, certain number of assignments, whatever. And we have these 15 classes that you have to go through, or 20 classes, whatever it is, the core is the bare minimum. And there be, say 3 or 4 classes dealing solely with hermeneutics and homiletics, several classes dealing solely with the traditional liturgical service and developing a Messianic Jewish service that is respective of both tradition and contemporary concepts, several leadership development courses, like how do you deal with problems that arise in your congregation, how do you create a budget, how do you organize this, how do you handle these kinds of things, but have requirements, and then also have 4 or 5 electives that feed into that.
Yeah, I'd actually like to see a 2-part structure, and I actually was sitting here thinking about the word structure and how we keep dancing around the word denomination, but I think what we're really asking for is more structure.
Yeah.
Whether we actually established a separate thing called the denomination or it just grew within what we have now. But I would love to see a structure that did just what you were saying, that provided a 1 or 2 year course, like an associate's degree kind of setup, where you did Hebrew and Greek, you did some overviews of the scripture, liturgy, those kind of things. But I also think it should be attached to a mentorship or a internship at a congregation or ministry structure where you got in Orthodox Judaism. When somebody you go to yeshiva and you're studying, which is a school, but you, in order to be a rabbi, you have to sit under a rabbi who then is actually the one that gives you smicha or ordination. And so I think both of those things would be together if we could, and funding for that would come through the organization. Or even if they went to a structure like some schools do. For instance, my other son, he went through school and he prepaid for his classes, and as long as he passed the class, he got reimbursed for that class, and as long as he finished the course, he got reimbursed for all of his expenses. So that would help in some way with that, so that somebody would actually complete the course, so there wasn't money thrown good after bad. But having a course structure that was designed specifically for Messianic Jewish studies, that were courses that would actually help in the process of leadership, and then an internship that went along with it that allowed them to work out those things, walk alongside somebody, experience, going to hospitals, visiting people in prisons, going to home visitations, doing the services, doing all of the structural stuff of a congregation leadership role that would give them that value also.
I think that and the thing is, I just want to go back to those, talking about those classes that the IMCS offers. The teachings are really good. I really did enjoy them, and there was some revelation in them, and there were some things that I got out of them. The problem is that, when you're talking about a situation with a student and a teacher. I taught public school for 15 years, and one of the things that they would always talk to teachers about is making sure you're giving feedback to your students. It's not that there's no onus on the students, they do the work and stuff, but the teachers also have to give feedback. And I I wrote this paper, and I worked really hard on it. Like, I know I worked hard on all my papers, and just to get you passed, and not here's some notes on what you said about this. Maybe consider this. This is really good. This isn't so good. This might not be I'm not going to sit there and say my theology is 100% sound. Everybody has issues in their theology. We're all growing, and we all have to be corrected. You know what I'm saying? There might be things we believe about our theology that aren't correct, and I would love to have known that instead of you passed. Because what it makes me think is you don't really care who's coming through
the gates
right now. And because any Joe Schmo can buy a DVD and listen to it, and of course we do have the experiential. We do have the everybody who's in the ordination program as a rabbi or assistant rabbi is in that position, so they are learning. That's not to say that there's nothing, but the actual academic portion of it is lacking on the IMCS side, definitely.
So maybe if there was even just someone who would call you, who had actually read your paper and say,
I read your paper, let's discuss it.
There's the key. Did they read it, or did they just go, you wrote it, okay, here you go?
I've actually thought
to this day, I don't even know where are the records of my transcripts. I've kept all my papers for the sheer purpose of being able to say,
I actually did this.
I did this because I'm afraid that maybe they'll say, well, we don't have your papers. And I'm like...
Which it has happened to people. It happened to my father-in-law.
Not naming any names.
So now that doesn't mean I want to say, here, you need a master's degree. I think that's too much.
Yeah. I think if there's... If the Lord puts it on your heart to go extra, like I'm working on a master's degree right now, not because I need it, I'm already ordained, but I'm working on one because I want it, because I have a goal outside of the congregation for it. Yeah. But I don't think that it should be an obligation to get a master's level education. I do think master's level classes,
yes,
the education side of it, not the actual degree is the better word. I think master's level education is necessary. Master's level degree is not. So like even in the IMCS presents their yeshivot classes as, and saying yeshivot classes is kind of redundant, but present their yeshivot as grad level classes, and the guys that teach them, they are grad level classes
or more.
Yeah, and so that's great. I think that it should be that way, but I don't think that it needs. I do feel that the other side of the argument is a little too far to the other side of the pendulum. There is that necessity for education, yes, but there's also the necessity for the practical application, which is what Rabbi Eric was saying, which is what you two are experiencing. And I don't think, for me, like 40 years ago, when the congregational aspect of the Messianic Jewish movement was starting, and it was literally 4 or 5 random congregations that had started sporadically separate from each other around the U.S., and they came together and said, hey, we should be in fellowship together. And that's what birthed what is now the congregational movement of the Messianic Jewish movement. That's great, and I understand that over the course of the next 10 to 20 years, it became necessary to go, okay, hey, there's another congregation in that state that's like us, let's bring them in, and there's another one in that state, let's bring them in, and now let's ordain those rabbis under this fellowship board. I understand that 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. But now we should be raising up leaders to start congregations, not letting people start congregations and then bringing them in once they've already done that. Like a lot of these guys that we bring into the organization have never been through our ordination process. They've never been through any of our educational classes. They may have never had any actual legitimate training in ministry. And that's not to say that it isn't, God gave you a call and you need to do this. Like that's a part of it, yes. But there is a practical side to that training that's necessary. And if we're not going to mess people, or if we don't want to mess people up more, I think those that have walked the walk and lived the life need to be sowing. And it goes back to what we said last time, that modelship of the priesthood, 30 to 50. And then after 50, you're raising up, you're educating, you're training. And I think that's where those yeshiva classes should be focused at.
Yeah, our model for raising up leaders should not be tossing someone in the middle of the ocean, and then if they are able to tread water for 2 years, then we'll send a ship by to pick them up and bring them to land. It should be raising up leaders, mentoring, and building a structure for that. And some of what each of you said dealt with this accountability factor that, the students are accountable to get their work done, but are the teachers being accountable to those students? Yeah. And is there relational building? And that goes beyond just the education. For instance, my congregation here in Pensacola has been part of the IMCS for almost 25 years, I believe it is. And not once in that 25 years has the regional leader of our organization attended our congregation or dropped by to visit or checked on us, or now check on us by email or by phone, but actually shown up. Nobody in my congregation, if they didn't go to the Southeast Regional, would know who our regional director was, because they've never been here. Now the reason that's important is, for instance, we just had last year a leader pass away at one of the congregations I'm on the board of. Now, that congregation knows me because I've been there. I've been there to fellowship. I've been there to speak. There's a relationship built. So when that leader passed and I was brought in with the leadership team to help set up a plan for a go-forward strategy, they knew who I was. They had a relationship with me and with the other people involved, so that they didn't push back like, who is this that's going to come tell us what to do? When you build relationships like that, when a crisis does arise or a leader falls or something happens, there's that relationship built. And the same thing with students. If you don't feel like your teacher cares about you beyond getting paid to teach their class, and you get a little note that says you passed, or an email that says you passed, rather than actual communication, you feel like it's a one-sided relationship.
So I'm going to actually toss this back to Rabbi Toby, because you bring up an interesting point, the idea of the teacher being accountable to the student, right? Well, Toby comes from an education background. That's what he did for, 15 years as a school teacher, right? Would the way that you feel like your classes were handled have ever flown in the school system?
Oh, no, you would have gotten in trouble for that.
So when you would make assignments to your students, how quickly were you expected to give feedback on it?
Within the week of putting that assignment in, you were supposed to give them feedback and put the grade in.
Yeah.
So and if that well, nobody does pass fail in public school, which we know that, but I'm just saying,
except for during COVID.
Right, basically.
Sorry, that was a bad joke.
But what I'm saying is that if I could do that for over let's just say on average 120 to 130 kids every day, on a day-by-day basis, whoever they have that's over that could at least look at these, and I mean, because it's 6 papers over a 2-year period.
Yeah,
I've had to grade 30 in one sitting,
which I also feel like that's 6 classes, 1 paper per class is not a substantial enough baseline to understand where that student is coming from, whether they've perceived what you taught and interacted with what you taught, and so on. I think there needs to be a few more assignments in that.
I will say, having for the credential, it's 10 pages for one class. Mm-hmm. I think for what it is, it's adequate. Yeah. But it should definitely be, there should be 10 hours in one paper, I think, they're what, 8-hour classes usually?
I think they're 8.
4, 6, it's anywhere from 4 to 8 hours.
I know they were long in one day.
It's 6. At least that's how many hours.
At least 6.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, when I took it, it was more. We had 2-day yeshiva classes that were all day long, and then my papers had to be 18 to 20 pages, and one of them had to be 28 pages.
Yeah.
But even at that, I think, and this is something I think Toby brought up that I appreciated because of his school background, is if you're only doing 6 or 8 page papers over your course, there's no means for assessing growth, assessing progress, assessing those kind of things. And I think somewhere in education, there's a requirement to assess maturity and growth and process. And if all you're doing is looking at a paper by a student, and you're only going to have that student one time to do that, the teacher doesn't have the ability to measure, did they learn something? Are they advancing? Or those kind of things.
Can I just say, you using the word maturity makes me really uncomfortable.
Why is that?
Because I refuse to be mature. No.
Oh, wow.
Don't mind getting older, just hate to grow up.
Yeah, I think, and the thing is, like with the speaking specifically to the yeshivot that the MCS does, there is no reason why, if you have qualified rabbis, that you can't actually parse out, all right, Rabbi so-and-so, these 10 classes, we're going to give you a year to watch these 10. This is already an ordained rabbi, someone who maybe has even served on the committee or something. Here, watch these 10, know these 10. You're responsible for these 10 classes. If any papers come in correlating to these classes, you're responsible for reading it, going over it, grading it, and then communicating with that student to talk about, and that was just a minimum.
Yeah,
that would just be a good starting place to make those worth more than they are.
And even if they didn't do it that way, every every rabbinic intern,
ordination process person,
in the ordination process is assigned somebody that is their mentee or mentor. And that person could interact with. In other words, if Rabbi Jonathan was doing a yeshiva course and he did his paper, he should have to send that paper to that person who's his mentor, who could then evaluate, discuss with him, send it back and build, and then have it turned into the professor. And that way that mentor would have the interaction and this relationship and see the growth that the teacher may not be able to do.
But that's part of the problem currently, is that individual that the person in the ordination process is supposed to communicate with exception of the rare case, and the person I was corresponding with was one of those rare exceptions. With exception of the rare case, are typically liberally best described as a liaison, not a mentor. And that's where the problem lies.
Exactly.
Is it can't be somebody that's like, oh, I'm super busy, so I'm going to throw an hour a month into dealing with this, and I've got to fit these 8 guys that are under me in this hour a month, or whatever it is. Like, there needs to be, like, that was one of the things I had Rabbi, and I'm going to brag on him for a minute, because I love, I said last time I don't throw names out for negative, but for positive, I'm going to brag on people, right? Rabbi Michael Wygant is who I corresponded with during my ordination process, and I absolutely loved that he was very intentional about being involved in the process. And we actually went through a pretty serious, like, traumatic experience in ministry during that period of time that he helped mentor through, and would call me on like a weekly basis. Hey, I just want to see how you're doing. What's the situation like? What's going on? He was by default was kind of mentoring me through us starting the congregation in Daphne and so on. I mean, just absolutely. As a matter of fact, he talked to me afterwards. He goes, "Look, I just need to let you know, you were really communicative on this, and you've kind of really set the bar high for everybody else I have to deal with, and I don't know that anybody else is going to meet it." But he was very intentionally involved, and I think that, and I won't call out names or negative, but I don't think that's been the case for most of the people I know who are going through or have been through the process, is they're not intentionally involved. And so it goes back to that idea of shepherds. Right. There needs to be a group of shepherds who are going to run that. I like the idea you suggested about, those Rabbi Jonathan, about those rabbis who are ordained being assigned a certain number of classes or topics or whatever to grade and correspond on, except that, at least currently, I don't know that an overwhelming majority of our rabbis are qualified to do that from an educational background. That's not to say that they aren't qualified, knowledge, experience, etc. But it's one thing to to teach a class. It's a whole other thing to be able to grade and give feedback as an educator would.
Yeah, and maybe that would be a good maybe that would be a good session at a rabbis conference. Like, have someone come in and bring the rabbis in, and several of them. And if this became a new thing, and again, like, I'd love to see the future of Messianic education be much bigger and a whole lot better. But just dealing with these, you
got to start somewhere.
The distance classes, start with somewhere. Have a session for the rabbis at the rabbis conference where it's like, okay, so here's how you grade. Here's what you look for, and it doesn't have to be like every super specific thing. Like, for example, they can say things like, by the way, if you're not good at copy editing, like, here's where you go learn that. Here's an online thing where you can learn how to copy edit, because
or here's a website you can copy paste in and it'll do most of it.
Or it'll do it for you. Well, and I think part of education is, like, if you're going to be writing or working with writing, you actually have to know the grammar. Like, that's part of the tool.
Again, this is something that I think that if someone is going to volunteer to be the mentor, to be the regional or area representative to oversee, that they should have a maximum amount of people that they're going to work with, but that they could be that person that interacted on the papers with the rabbinic intern and go back. I can tell you from my experience, and I'm not going to mention who my person was when I went through the ordination program, but his requirement for communication was send me an email every month that says I'm still alive. And honestly, that was like, I'm still here, we're still going. That was all he wanted. He didn't want to know what was going on in our community, what was going on with my family. He just let me know you're still here.
Yeah.
And it's got to be more than that in the process.
And I think that's what I'm getting at, is like, we have enough rabbis in the Messianic movement to where there's no reason why we couldn't have each rabbi taking 3 or 4 classes and just being responsible for grading any papers that come in related to that class. So it can be done. Have someone come in and do kind of an overview of teaching how to do this. because it really is, if they want to continue to use those, I think it is important that they actually have people communicating with the students who are taking those classes.
Have a system of feedback, and it shouldn't, I mean, I'm not saying it can't be pass-fail, but my feedback shouldn't just be that I passed.
Yeah, you should be,
because I question whether or not somebody even read my paper.
Yeah, because like if you just get a fail, like, and no feedback, no one calls you to talk to you, like, why did I fail?
Why did I fail? Right? Why did I pass? Why did I pass?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to this idea: we can either have separate rabbis that do that, or a rabbi that is mentoring a intern at his congregation that could do that and interact with their papers and help them.
Yeah, and I think you can have them interact with their papers. What I'm specifically saying is, like, there's so many classes at this point that are recorded that it would be difficult for one person to, okay, why, I understand the title of this class, but why did you write this? And it may be in response to something that the teacher said, whereas if you have someone who's actually, the steering committee said, hey, Rabbi so-and-so, we're giving you a year, heads up, watch these 10 classes, you're responsible for these 10.
To that end, I think the fact that there are so many shows us sort of some of the degree of streamlining things that's needed, because most of what's available have been the recordings from the last 30 years or whatever. Like there's all of the regionals have a yeshiva. Messiah has 2 yeshivas. Used to, rabbis would have a yeshiva. Rabbi Conference had a yeshiva available, etc. And those are all recorded and available for distance. But there's no core. There's no curriculum. Core curriculum. Like I think, first off, they should go, okay, we need X number of this category of classes for each person. X number of this category of classes. X number of this, and anything in the database that doesn't fit into one of those categories needs to be tossed. And anything over a certain age needs to be tossed and redone. One, because the videography is going to be terrible. The audio is going to be terrible.
You've seen some of the ones that were recorded in the 90s.
Yeah. And 2, because, look, things have developed. Things have grown. We've learned. So I think it's important to constantly updating. And with this, like, not only should there be a better organizational structure for the education side of raising up rabbis and leaders in general, because I think we could reasonably develop something for youth leaders and for worship leaders and so on, which I know you were a part of something trying to do similar to that, Rabbi Toby, but for worship leaders. But I think there needs to be in the ordination expectations a requirement for furthering education, continuing education. Every year there should be, or at least every 2 years, there should be a minimum baseline for continuing education. You've got to go and take one class, and whatever it is in this area, or one yeshiva, pick one off the wall or whatever.
Yeah, and I'd even like to see something to the effect of where you have so many, with continuing education, if you have so many rabbis every year submitting an essay on a topic to whoever's above them, whether it's the rabbi, the shepherd of shepherds, or even the steering committee, 1 or 2 a year, and then those essays get put into a published, like, that's owned by the Messianic, structure, and that's something that everyone can read. It's published, and then if someone just sitting in a pew every Shabbat wants to see what the rabbis around,
a rabbinic journal, like you would have a medical journal, something that
peer reviewed, and
I
think that'd be good.
Yeah, and we tried to start an internship program, over a summer internship program in throughout both organizations, the union and the IMCS. We had raised the funds to fund the entire thing, so the congregations weren't responsible for anything other than housing the intern and making sure they had food. All the other expenses, including a stipend for the intern, were covered already by our group that was establishing this, and we sought out 6 congregations that would host an intern for 2 weeks. Each congregation would have to host 2 interns over a summer, and we could not find 6 congregations to start the pilot program that would be willing to house an intern for 2 weeks over the summer, for a 1 month, where they would have 2 weeks of one intern, 2 weeks of another, so that 6 interns would have the opportunity to visit
6 different congregations.
Yeah, or 2 interns would each have opportunity to go to different congregations. So they would experience, for instance, our congregation is going to be structured a little different than Rabbi David's, and so on for the other congregations. They would see how the rabbis do, mirror them through the week so they could see how they plan, what their schedule is, what their organization structure is, so that they would see hands-on what Messianic ministry actually is outside of a classroom. And we couldn't get 6 congregations to volunteer to host that. So part of the problem that I see with what we're talking about is that and sometimes we need to get the leaders to get behind this stuff, even if it's not going to necessarily benefit their congregation. It benefits the movement as a whole. Yeah. And so when we talk about internships, when we talk about education, when we talk about rabbis grading papers or interacting and stuff, there's some kind of switch that's going to have to click in the minds of those in our movement, whether it becomes from a fellowship to a denomination, but the structural change of saying, I'm doing this because the movement is going to benefit rather than I'm doing this because my congregation necessarily will.
Yeah, and that's the weakness of the fellowship, or one of the weaknesses of the fellowship model is, with that, you're like asking, and in some cases practically begging people to get on board with, helping to move the movement further along, whereas in a denominational model, it's more, by the way, you are expected this summer to host an intern or whatever, and the steering committee or council, whatever above that, has the authority to say, do this, and you have to do it, because if you don't, then there are ramifications for that. But and that's one of the things is that there's people talk about future, people talk about moving forward, but then when it comes to actually getting that question, they get that phone call saying, hey, you gave a great speech this last rabbis conference on the future of the Messianic movement, the future of training up new young leaders. I have here's the thing: it's funded, we have the money. We just need you to host a student. And they're like, and that's where the weakness of the fellowship model. One of the weaknesses definitely comes through, because you can get out of expectations. Whereas in the book of Acts and in many of the books of the Brit Chadashah, like when Paul or Peter or the council laid down expectations, those expectations were expected to be met or else. So
I think that, too, with looking at the other end of it, a big problem that I see with being so heavy-handed on the education is, I'm not saying that everybody who comes out of an educational program, whether it's a master's degree or even a doctorate, that they come out like holy and pious, because education doesn't do that for you. The Holy Spirit does, the Lord does. But there is this air of like, if you don't go down this path of education, you will not be addressed as a rabbi. And I think that's insulting. Now, do I have a problem with that? Yes, but it's honestly, I would rather be the guy not called rabbi than be the guy who's not calling someone rabbi, because that person is a little bit closer to being the Pharisee on the front row that Yeshua was talking about. I don't like the pious air of, well, no, we're not going to call you rabbi because you didn't take all these classes and spend all this money. And I'm like...
Or you don't carry our ordination, so you're not a rabbi.
Right, and I think that's dumb. And I do think that the Messiah would absolutely laugh in the face of some of that stuff and say, this is ridiculous. This is just stupid. Anyway.
Rabbi Jeffrey Seif calls them PhD deities. PhD deities, the people who think that their education puts them into a higher level of humanity.
Right.
Yeah, it should put you in a higher level of humility. And if that's anything I've learned, having been to school and any education, is that like, no, I should be more humble.
It can increase your knowledge. I'm not saying that you can. There are biblical scholars that can run circles around me with the Bible and stuff and with the Torah. But that doesn't make one acceptable to God, and it doesn't make one usable.
It also can ruin your humility.
It can.
It can make you a really arrogant person. I have this degree from this.
Right.
And I will say that it does. I've seen both sides of that. I've also seen the people who, they have no problem slandering a biblical scholar simply for the fact that they are a biblical scholar. And I've seen many biblical scholars who are very humble, but again, because it's not just the information that they know they're familiar with, but they're familiar with God. They know God and they walk with God, and so that gives them that humility. But yeah, I've seen both sides. I've seen the super elitist mentality from the educated side, and I've also seen we don't listen to scholars because they go to them propaganda schools.
Right. Like I said, I would rather be someone that someone doesn't deem like, you're not a rabbi. I'd rather be that guy that's being called that than someone who's on the other side of that line and saying, no, we don't consider that. I'm like, I'd rather not be you. Because,
I have an acquaintance who's a pastor of a large congregation who doesn't teach at his congregation. Very rarely he'll get up and talk for a few minutes, but he's got people that are outstanding teachers that do the teaching and do the preaching, and he does the interpersonal fellowship, relational home visits, things like that. He works with those leaders to shepherd them, to guide them, and they've got an excellent, loving community. But he doesn't have all the degrees and all that. He's got people around him that are educated and taught and went through schools and all. But he's shepherding and loving his people. And then he's got other people that do the things that we would typically say, man, he's a good pastor because he's a great teacher, or because he's wrote this many books, or he did this stuff, when the reality is a great pastor is a shepherd that shepherds his flock. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that nobody should be a pastor that teaches or has, but as Toby's talking about, he's really talking about the heart of the leader.
Yeah.
And, are we really about serving? Yeshua took his outer garments off and washed his disciples' feet. That's leadership, regardless of education or that. And of course, I'm not saying Yeshua wasn't educated. He wrote the book. So, but I'm just saying it's important that we don't lose these things in the process.
Yeah.
So we're all for education and promoting solid education, good education, but not at the expense of humility. And I think Toby made a great point about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
I have a couple more things in my mind. I'm back to kind of with the education thing. People we do kind of we note that the apostles were not of men of letters, as Yeshua is accused of being, but when you walk literally in the dust of God for several years, I think you're qualified above and beyond to understand what it is you're supposed to be teaching, which is the words of your rabbi, and we follow after the rabbi of rabbis. We follow after the teacher of teachers. So, education should be important to us, at least in that sense. And again, doesn't mean you're getting degrees, but it means you are sitting at the feet of someone. You are learning, his words and walking after him. Both Yeshua and the rabbi that you get to sit under. And I brought it up last episode. But I'd like to see, in terms of rabbinic education, I'd like to see, your project idea, the idea of the interns, transferring around, come about for people who think God may be calling them into ministry. Go and spend...
Get a taste of it,
Yeah, get a taste of it. Go spend a summer between, while you're in college, one summer. You may not, or you may just be, a young kid. You may be 17 or 18, not having left the house yet. You're still in high school, and you think you're about to go in that direction. Well, it's a great time in your years to go and get a taste of it, to see if is God calling me to this? Is God calling me to go and be at a hospital at 2 a.m. to pray with someone? Is God calling me to be available for funerals and for weddings and to celebrate the joys and the sorrows of life with people? Is God calling me to teach His word? Taste it. And then move into the actual, get in that pipeline. And what I'd like to see with the pipeline is actually kind of like what you did, actually go off to school. Get out from under your parents. Yeshua's disciples didn't stay up under their mother, their parents. They joined with their rabbi. Be at a congregation. And this is a strength of the more structured model, the denominational model, is you can, the fund, and I mentioned this last episode, the funds would be there to be able to help support a young person, especially if they're unmarried and don't have kids, be able to support them in actually living there and being there and sitting at the feet of that rabbi, and learning those things while he accrues whatever educational requirements are set forth by, whatever leadership, whether it's a council or whatever, and able to do that for, even if it's just a couple years, that's a lot, especially for, a 19, 20-year-old person.
Yeah.
And then by the end of, you get through that, and you get ordained, like, you've actually done discipleship. You've sat at the feet of a rabbi. You've walked in the dust of a rabbi.
So I can tell you, I know a number of younger individuals, whether we're talking, because in the Messianic movement, the focus is only on millennials, but whether we're talking millennials who are now realistically in their 30s or older, or crowds younger than them going down even to like getting out of high school age, I've talked to a number of people who have just straight up told me, I feel like I have a calling on my life to be a Messianic Jewish rabbi. However, and this is the reality when you're talking about young leaders currently, yes, there are those coming straight out of high school like I was that were willing to step in that. But for the most part, you're talking about people in their early mid-20s to their early 30s who may very well have a family started already or be starting a family. And I've had young guys who have been very interested in being a rabbi who feel like, and just straight up said, I feel like God has called me to be a Messianic rabbi. However, I cannot afford to do it financially because the congregations can't pay me and my family needs to eat, and I cannot afford to, and this is something that I talk about a lot, is, that they would say, I can't afford to go and serve under a rabbi and train and be built up, making no money with heavy expectations, and then also work a full-time job outside of that, because then I can't be there for my family. Yeah. And that's the reality of it, is, and we've talked about it on this the show before, is when you're in ministry, especially congregational ministry, when you're in ministry, it is a full-time job, whether you like it or not. This is why Paul says the worker is worth his wages, right? When you're in ministry, no matter what, it is absolutely a full-time gig. You are dedicated to that. Rabbi Jonathan brought up the 2 a.m. hospital visits, the births, the deaths, the funerals, the planning for events and services, the navigating marriage crises and family crises and all of these kinds of things. It is a full-time gig. And if you have a young family, which most people, potential targets for young leadership, most people are going to have young families, then in order to go into ministry, you're going to have to be full-time in that role, but you're likely also going to have to be full-time outside of that in a job, which means the only people losing isn't the congregation, it's your family. And if your family is losing out, then you've got, Paul makes it very clear, you got to take care of your household first before you can sow into the community, right? They need to look at your household as the example of your shepherding. And if they can't do that, then it's a problem. And so most of the Messianic movement, the way we're set up right now, most of the Messianic movement, the individual congregation cannot afford to pay a salary to a younger leader wanting to come in and be an assistant rabbi or rabbinic intern or whatever you want to call it. They're not able to afford that. And there's no infrastructure set up on the grander scale in the fellowship model or whatever else. There's no infrastructure set up for the organizations, the congregational organizations, to be able to assist in that. And so because of that, you end up with a ton of young people who truly feel a calling to Messianic ministry that either never answer it because they feel like they have to take care of their family, which is a valid thing, and the congregation cannot help them with that, or they end up in church ministry instead of in a Messianic synagogue because the churches have money and they've got the infrastructure set up and they're willing to pay and to do the training and to do the experiential side and to give you the education. They're willing to be a part of that. And look, there's a lot about the church world that doesn't really jive in the Messianic community, and I get that. But as Messianic Judaism as a whole, we've got to stop being afraid of learning how to glean from what the church does do right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to make two quick comments on that thing that you were just talking about. And that is that, first of all, I think that we definitely need to, as a movement, pool resources to help fund young people. But the other side of that is, I think we're deceiving ourselves when we say we can't afford to hire somebody and pay them. In my experience, now there are congregations that are too small. It's just reality. But most congregations, in my experience, and I've seen this happen over and over at our congregation, when we saw a need to put somebody in a position, when we grew to a place where we need to hire somebody for the congregation, you can look and say, we need this, but we can't afford it, and just stay where you are and do without those things. Or you can step out and trust. We tell our congregants, give to God and trust that He'll take care of you. Give to God and He'll meet your needs. Be faithful to God and He'll provide. Yeah. But then when it comes to our congregations, we say we can't afford to do what we feel God is calling us. In other words, when we were ready to hire an assistant rabbi, we hired an assistant rabbi and trusted that God would grow our congregation as a result of our listening to Him and provide that. And so our congregation, again, is unique. And please know, we make plenty of mistakes. We're not perfect in any way. But we have 4 full-time office people, a part-time office person, myself, Rabbi Jonathan, a part-time yard and maintenance person, and God provides every month, not only to pay for all of the needs that they have to meet their needs, and we pay them like a real salary. It's not, you're in ministry, so starve to death. But we did that because we trusted. If you hear from God, I'm not telling you if you don't hear from God, but if you hear from God, when you grow to a point where you can only do so much, and then you have to either extend out and grow or decide we're just going to stay where we are. And so I think it takes both. I think one of it is the congregation has to have the faith to step out and say, we're going to, and talk to your people and say, we're going to hire someone, which means we're trusting that you're going to be faithful and do this. And then the other side of that is, as an organization, the congregations that are a little larger and are able to give should give, and the little ones should give what they can to fund, so both sides meet in the middle.
Yeah, and leaders need to not be afraid to ask. And I know a lot of damage has been done, specifically in this country, when it comes to religious people asking for money. Like, I'm not excusing that. There's been a lot of damage done, a lot of real damage done. But leaders don't need to be afraid to ask for money, because we're not afraid to at the conferences. So why can't we at our congregations? Why can't we ask people? Because here's the deal. I was listening to a podcast recently, and they were going over the statistics of how many people, and this was churches, not Messianic congregations, how many people in churches tithe on average. Or just, even if you don't want to call it a tithe, how many people give a percentage to their congregation, their fellowship, whatever. And the number was staggering. It was like 4% actively tithe.
It's 4 to 6% nationally.
Less than 10% of people actually give consistently, which is, I was shocked. Like, it was one of those, like, your stomach drops to your feet. And like, of all the things, like, all the problems that we have that are related to not having enough, so we could do if we had enough. So leaders, rabbis, don't be afraid to ask your people, because a lot of times your people will step up. Even if they're not giving a 10%, if you even just had like pledges, be like, if you're in our congregation, if you're a member, would you mind pledging this much? Or, hey, I am in my late 60s and we need to hire an assistant rabbi who is going to take over in the next 10 years potentially. I need some people to pledge this much a month to be able to afford a salary to take care of this new leader we're going to bring in. That's a completely reasonable thing to do. Like, don't be afraid to act. Like, people are coming, and people are getting from you teaching and your ministry, your prayers, your time, your empathy, your compassion, your family's time. So don't be afraid to ask them when you need. And people, don't be afraid to ask your leaders what you can give, and even if it's not money, it may be time. They may need more time. Don't be afraid to volunteer. The things we could do with if more would volunteer, if more people would step up to do. And the thing is, and I'm not afraid to say it, I despise when people come into the Messianic movement from churches and they come with this attitude of, well, I'm not tithing and I'm not giving. They may have been great tithers at their church before they got, into wherever position. A lot of people come from bad places into the Messianic movement. Like they get disillusioned with the church, or they find out maybe the church taught some things that weren't entirely true, a couple things here, or maybe they lied to me about this, and then they come in and they're so disillusioned. They're coming from such a place of hurt and fear that they just don't give, and they come and all they do is take, and they take the time, they take the worship, and then they expect it to be catered to them. And I've seen this dozens of times. Specifically, I know it happens in churches too, but specifically in Messianic, Hebrew roots congregations, it's like they come and, I don't like that music. The music's supposed to be catered to me. And they complain and they want things to be changed, but then they don't actually. There's no skin in the game for them. Like they just show up and exist. And you just can't show up and exist. Like if you're going to be there, if you're going to be a member of a congregation, if you're going to be part of that corporate body that is worshiping and being the window into the kingdom of God for that community, you do need to give, and you need to find out how you can give of yourself. It doesn't just have to be money. Again, it can be of your time, of volunteering. So, but don't be afraid to ask leaders.
Yeah. So as we're getting ready to wrap up, I want to ask Rabbi Toby and Rabbi Jonathan one question, give them time to respond to it. And that is this: both of you are in the educational process right now to become ordained. If there was one thing that the Messianic movement, that the IMCS or even our congregations individually could do to make that process easier, to help you to do something, what would that one thing be? And you guys think about it for just a second. And I'm saying this because some of the people listening right now that will listen to this may be somebody who's looking for an opportunity to do something. And giving, because you guys, I'm not in that place. Rabbi David's not in that place, but you guys are both in that place, and we're talking about it on this episode. So if there's one thing that the organization that regionally could be done, or nationally, or whatever, to help you with your process, what would that one thing be?
You mean like the current process I'm in now?
The process you're in right now, because other people are going to be in that place. And if we know how we can help you, that means we're prepared to help someone that steps into that place in the future, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I answered this. I answered a similar question last episode, I think. And that's, mine would be, there needs to be a system, set up a structure where people, especially young people, but like David said, people also with families can be supported and are able to live and eat and be sheltered, and can be brought to a community if they're not already living there, to sit at the feet of the rabbi there and to follow him.
Right, but in your case, you've got most of that. So
yeah, I do.
So I'm asking specifically,
in my case,
specifically to you, what one thing could the organization, could Messianic Judaism, could people do to make your situation? Because both of you are in similar but different situations in the process.
I wish there was an option when it comes to the as we currently sit with the yeshivot. I wish there was an option to only do live yeshiva classes. So I wish they would offer more at the conferences. So, and not just because I know Messiah offers at least 2 usually a week, but if they could offer at the regional ones more, so that, for example, I would be totally cool if I'm in the pipeline of ordination. I will give up going to the different sessions. I will give up like a lot of the social time that you get during the day to take a class a day. And that's 3 classes. Like you can knock out 3 classes. Now that would be a lot. That'd be intense. But I would rather have that where I can engage relationally with that rabbi or teacher or professor teaching there at the thing, get my questions answered live in real time before I engage in writing whatever paper is required of me for that class.
An easy way to do that would simply be, rather than, you can provide them at the conference also, but also provide them throughout the year, maybe on a quarterly basis as a online, like a GoToMeeting or Zoom or whatever style class, but you do it 3 hours at a time. Do a 3-hour session, and then the next week a 3-hour session or whatever over 2 or 3 weeks instead of all in once, and then you've got the time to converse. But yeah, that's a great idea.
I just think more regular and deliberate and reliable communication, I guess, with your mentor. That's probably all I would say. That would make something easier.
Okay.
Or the regional director, I guess, maybe.
Yeah. Again, so kind of dealing with what we've talked about is relational connection, and part of that, even with this live class, is this relational connection and a more structured educational plan and internship plan. Seems to be what you guys are both saying would be helpful in the process.
Well, with that, we appreciate you joining us for this episode. As we've said a few times now, this is going to be a series of conversations that we have, not specifically on education, but as we ourselves kind of work through what we would like to see or what we think would be beneficial for the Messianic Jewish movement in out of going from a fellowship model to more of a structured model, or even better structuring the fellowship model if that's what's deemed the best option. But just some ideas we have at how we could better develop the Messianic Jewish movement for a legitimate longevity of existence and purpose and fulfilling our greater calling. So thank you for joining us. We will see you next time. Shalom. Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.